I'm Benjamin Pollard with an episode of Chatter for July 2nd, 2022. For today's episode, the team at Lawfare decided to cross-post this week's episode of Chatter, a podcast hosted by David Priess and Shane Harris that features in-depth discussions with fascinating people at the creative edges of national security. Today's Chatter episode is entitled Secret Service Dilemmas and Training with Jonathan Wackrow. This week's surprise hearing from the House January 6th committee, its sixth in a series of public hearings, revealed new information about President Trump's altercation with a member of the Secret Service on January 6th. In the episode, Priess sat down with Wackrow to discuss the committee's revelations, how cable news networks cover tragedy, the challenges of providing insight on security incidents in real time, and more. This is Chatter.
Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess, publisher of Lawfare. This week, former U.S. Secret Service Special Agent Jonathan Wackrow on Secret Service Dilemmas and Training.
Every single tactic that we deploy today has a history. There's a lineage back to why are we doing this. That's what makes the Secret Service so great, is that they're constantly trying to improve. Threats will take the path of least resistance, and they'll keep pressure testing to find that least resistance. You have to make sure that you find it first and mitigate it so a threat doesn't exploit that vulnerability. I have seen the President of the United States say, I am not doing X. And because of a clear and present life safety issue, either you're going to do it on your own or we're physically going to make you do it.
John, it is great to be talking to you. I used to associate you with goodness because we would chat and I'd always get a smile on my face and I'd leave in a better place. But the last couple of years, I haven't seen you in person except on CNN, and that's usually when bad shit went down. How does it feel to be associated in so many people's eyes with public tragedy?
Well, that's a great question, David. And it's something that myself and my colleagues, the other law enforcement analysts, we've often talked about that, over the past few years, is that we're never brought in for any type of good story. We're always brought in the middle or in the aftermath of some sort of tragic situation where you have to give near real-time commentary to a very discerning audience about what is going on, like what is happening. And you may not even understand yourself what is happening. And right. I look at moments of like being woken up in the middle of the night for the Las Vegas shooting. That was going on, and we went on the air right away and stayed on for hours. And that does you start getting associated with these tragedies, and right. You're marked by when you provided that commentary on the Garlic Festival shooting or Las Vegas or Parkland. All of these tragedies add up. But what you start seeing is the commonality around a lot of these tragic situations. And as time has gone on, you almost can get into a little bit of predictability around, what was that motive? Like, was there some sort of grievance? What type of individual would cause this type of horrific situation? So it's tough to be associated with tragedy all the time when you're giving that commentary. But I think that if there's any type of positive, is that you're able to bring some sort of resolution to that issue because of your institutional knowledge that you've garnered by covering these tragedies for so long.
Yeah, I mean, that's the answer that I expected you to give, right? Because you do tend to go on when, honestly, people have been shot or otherwise hurt. That's the most common thing. Sometimes it is a report about a security scare at the White House where someone has not been injured or killed, but most often people are dead. But it seems like the way to say, I'm adding value here is to explain this is what could have led to the situation, but we need the facts. This is what law enforcement at various levels is doing in response to the threat and in the investigation. So you're helping people come to grips with it. You're not wallowing in the tragedy. You're actually trying to provide some sense of order, to impose some stability to the situation.
Well, and I think that's right, David. And the reason being is that as a risk practitioner broadly, I spend a lot of my time on what we refer to as like the left of boom, the preparedness for any type of eventuality, whether it's a tactical issue, whether it's a natural disaster, any type of event. If you think about it in like three phases, actually: preparation, response, and recovery, distilling it down very simply. That preparation side then allows me in that moment to
Mhm.
bring some clarity as to what is going on, because crisis situations are unpredictable, they're dynamic, they're multifaceted. People are confused as to what exactly is going on, and if you can try to bring some logic to that confusion to help lower anxiety in the moment, give them some clarity of what are first responders, public safety, what are they doing to address this situation, it starts to bring a sense of calm. Not immediately, but that's what you try to do every time that you get on air. You're literally you handed this situation that you may not have any idea about, but you learn very quickly. And there's a nomenclature to managing a crisis. And if you start just pulling out those different aspects of that nomenclature and explain it to the audience as succinctly as possible, distilling down those most the salient points, the points, so they can digest that singular moment, then you've done your job. If you add to the confusion, or you start bringing in political factors, or start compiling and compounding the issue on air, that's not additive. That becomes detractive. So you
Mm.
try to make sure that everything you say in that moment is additive to the resolution of that immediate crisis.
Yeah, I think that's important to keep in mind, because there are some, and we should be clear here, we've left it assumed, but you are a CNN analyst, and that's where you offer your information and insight. Some outlets are not as careful. That is, they will have people on who do a lot of speculation as a tragedy is unfolding about things like motives, and that's sometimes that speculation is right, but more often than not, it is wrong, and it's necessarily incomplete. You personally don't do that. Well, without judging CNN as a network, but broadening it out, let me ask you about kind of the implication of that, which is 24/7 news has space to fill, and when there's a tragedy, that often jumps above other longstanding concerns, whether it's a war in Ukraine, or whether it's political tension over Supreme Court rulings and other things. But does that sensationalize it? Do you find that you worry, again, not necessarily about your network, but in the overall media environment we're in now, that as opposed to when we grew up, when there was much more limited engagement, now there is almost an inherent tendency to over magnify some aspects of a tragedy, and to sensationalize it in a way that causes more stress and anxiety than needs to be the case?
Well, let me try to break that down a little bit differently. I think that news outlets broadly are just responding to the new domain that they operate in. And what I mean by that is the digital domain today moves at lightning speed. So information flows are almost instantaneous. And because you have this instantaneous information flow, so a rocket lands in the middle of you know Kiev earlier today. I mean, we had a notification 2 or 3 minutes later of that disaster. And now everybody on social media is reporting about it, commenting on it, well before traditional news outlets even can get a jump on it. So when they do get that jump on the story and they go to air, they have to fill it with a void that social media may not be picking up. So yes, there's a sense of sensationalism that can be in the moment. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's trying to keep pace with what is going on by their audience, who's consuming this information, and the speed by which they're consuming it is constantly a challenge for for media outlets. And I think it's just it's a different style of reporting that has really changed even in the last couple of years. The availability of technology, working remotely, sharing video now because you can compress that video on social media so easily. I can now get almost near real time video of an incident that's going on, and that's a challenge for producers who are sitting in the newsroom saying, how do I tell this story when 80% of it's already been told? So they have to work backwards a little bit to verify what's already out there to then get into, okay, how do we report this?
Do you find yourself probably not engaging directly with the producers on that because you're about to go on the live hit, but in your mind, do you find yourself kind of playing the same role, which is deciding what you can comment on when you have seen just one image of an incident? How do you put, in a sense, the brakes on yourself? Because you've got a lot of experience, which we'll get to in a few minutes. You have a lot of experience that gives you judgment about, oh, I've seen this scenario before. Here are the likely parameters. On the other hand, you realize you're just seeing one image before you go on air, and you have a limit to what you can say. How do you balance that?
It is a challenge. And again, the speed by which these incidents are happening, in the speed to market, right? The speed by which a story, an incident occurs, a story develops, and you go to air can be less than a minute. And I'll give a good example. A couple months ago, there was a shooting in New York City on the subway in Brooklyn. Right. And it happened just at the tail end of rush hour in the morning. And I was, a very rare day, I was actually sitting at my desk in the office. And I happened to turn on the television. Just as the television was turning on, it was CNN. And I look up and it's the two of the morning anchors are sitting there. And they're just talking about a story. Then I see breaking news. Shooting in New York. Yeah. And I stand up. So this is now we're maybe 10 seconds into the breaking news coverage starting. My phone rings. And it's the newsroom, and they say, we're putting you on the air right now. And I say, okay. And David, I know you've been in these situations before. That you have a producer that's trying to manage 7,000 things, and you say, okay. The next thing I hear is we're now bringing in Jonathan Wackrow, law enforcement analyst for CNN.
You don't even know what you're going to be asked. Right.
I know so all I know it's a shooting, and it's in New York City. I don't know. I didn't know it was on the subway. Didn't know any of any context whatsoever. And Jim Scudo, who I really admire from CNN, he throws that toss up. Yeah. Jonathan, how do you assess the situation right now? Well, thanks, Jim, because I'm looking at you on television trying to figure out what this moment is. Yeah. But I knew it was a shooting. So what does that mean? All right, a shooting in New York City has a standard protocol by the NYPD. It has a standard protocol by EMS in the fire department that they've practiced on time and time again. So as you start explaining to the public what the first responders are doing in that immediate moment, then you get more information. Okay, subway, got it. MTA, closures. I can start going through all of those protocols. You're trying to, again, reassure the public that while there's this clear and present danger of not only the shooting just occurred, but they didn't capture the shooter. What is law enforcement doing? What are the first responders doing? How is the mayor and public officials, how are they trying to protect this city from a clear and present danger? And that's what you have to do very quickly on the fly.
Yeah. So even when it appears chaotic, and it is because you don't have a lot of the details, you are imposing that order. You're saying there are protocols being followed. Here is what they're doing. You're not going to see most of it, but this is what's happening behind the scenes. Therefore, we are likely to see this in the next 5 minutes, and this in the next 5 hours, and this in the next 5 days. Don't confuse those.
Exactly. And what I try to do is provide analysis, not opinion, right? Like, oh, this is bad. And I don't want this to be John Wackrow's opinion of a situation. I want to give those facts immediately based upon historical context, my training, my experience, tactics that I've deployed in the past, known tactics of like the NYPD. stay as factual as possible to that incident.
Right. Well, that does go back to your experience. So let's get into that. I really wanted to talk to you a lot in the context of what's been happening in recent weeks and months, perhaps growing over the past several years, of the increasing threat of, no kidding, political violence in this country of the type that we haven't seen since maybe the Weather Underground of some 50 years ago. I wanted to talk to you about your experience and how it does relate to everything from personal security to the way institutions can learn from each other in the security realm. So let's talk about your experience. You bring most of your experience on this, not just from your recent work in consulting in various risk contexts, but from your career in the Secret Service. Talk about that. Why did you join the Secret Service, and how did you make your way there?
So my pathway to the Secret Service was, I think, really unique. It's not a fairy tale story or something that I had thought of for years. It really came out of wholly understanding what the women and men of the Secret Service were doing day in and day out. And I'll take a step back into the late 90s. I was working in the hospitality industry in New York City.
Back when you were a young man, right?
A young man, very young man. And I had the opportunity, I was in sales, and I actually sold government accounts, hotel rooms to, political figures, to any type of government employee. And what we saw was, between 97 and 2000, you had the Clintons leaving office, moving to New York. So Chappaqua, very close proximity to New York City. So we ended up having a lot of the White House staff stay at one of my properties. We had the Secret Service stay at my properties. We had White House Communications stay at my properties. Then you had Al Gore, who was running for president at the time, have his daughter living in New York and just having his first grandchild.
Yeah.
So at any moment in time, I had the president or vice president, first lady or second lady staying in my hotel. So I was surrounded for almost 24 months by Secret Service agents, White House officials, military all the time. So I got this different viewpoint. I didn't get the brochure viewpoint. I got the viewpoint of those officers and agents standing in a hallway, standing in a stairwell for 12 hours on end, on the holiday weekends, at night. And I started asking myself, why would anybody do this job?
Yeah, that's
that
an odd recruitment pitch right there.
Yeah. But then I got to talking to the different individuals, supervisors, agents, local agents out of the New York field office, people that were on the detail. And I heard this commonality of why they're doing it. They're not doing it for themselves. They were doing it for something greater. And they had a shared fate amongst all of them as they worked. They were mission driven. They were not going to accept failure on anything. No matter how difficult the moment was, they were all very focused on how to provide that protection. I saw that esprit de corps amongst the officers and agents alike. And all of a sudden I said, I want to be that. I want to do that. I wonder if I could do it. Because I just saw how highly trained and how highly competent and smart and intellectually curious every single one of them were. And I said, I wonder if I could actually become an agent. But I always pushed it off to the side. It was something that all of a sudden became in my head, but I wasn't focused on until there was a gentleman who's the head of the vice president's detail at the time, William Pickle. Mm-hmm. He came up to me and said, "Hey, you're with us constantly. And are friends with everybody here and people on my detail. And you seem to have a real interest in doing this work, not only just from the protection side, but also from the investigative side. And you're asking 100 questions."
There's two ways to take that, John. One way is, wow, you're really interested in this. Would you want to be part of this mission? The other one is, what's wrong with you, stalker? Are
Yeah,
you a
yeah.
threat to our protectees?
Well, thankfully, it was the former, right? Otherwise, I would have been in protective custody. And he ended up handing me an envelope, and it was a bunch of forms that David, you're probably familiar with. That the SF-86 form, the standard form to try to obtain a national security clearance.
Mhm.
And so I took a look at that and I said, okay. Then there was the Secret Service application inside of that. And I said, okay. I looked at it, and this was circa 98, maybe 99. And it said, all answers must be typed on a typewriter.
How
I said,
about that?
well, this was a good run. I really don't need to be in the Secret Service. I thought to myself, like,
It's just
I'm
too
not
hard to
typing.
find a
I
typewriter,
just
so I'll
can't
give up
find
on
a
a promising
typewriter.
career.
Yeah, but I ended up getting the typewriter. I did it, never thinking like through all the phases that I'd be able to join this group of women and men that I really held in high regard. I really had a lot of respect for the work that they did. And listen, I'm humbled every single day to say that I was part of that group, part of the group that I saw held to such a high standard. They held themselves to that standard. I just look back at it very fondly every second that I was in that agency. But it comes down to that first moment of understanding what the job was about,
Mhm.
and then really wanting it.
Yeah, yeah. And you understood what the job was about at a very tactical level in a
Mhm.
very precise situation, which is hotel security for a protectee who is not a head of state. Although maybe you did have heads of state visit as part of UNGA. I know they go out in
Yeah.
hotels pretty far for the annual General Assembly meetings when you have about 8 billion protectees come into
Mhm.
to New York. But still a very precise situation. You could not have known the infinitely wider nature of the job at that point. You obviously discovered that upon interviewing, and then much more so upon joining and going through training. Without giving away anything that would jeopardize the security benefits of that training, talk us through that process. How much of it was standard, FLETC type stuff of law enforcement? How much of it was learning the lessons of previous presidential assassinations and other threat scenarios to protectees? What was the balance of that training?
Well, the balance was actually there's training is really held in two parts. The Secret Service officers and agents go through two separate and distinct academies. The first academy is what you had just referenced. It's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, typically held down in Glencoe, Georgia, and that is a common baseline academy that just about all in federal law enforcement outside of like the FBI go through. To have a common baseline of information on how to become an officer, how to become an agent, a GS 1811 or 1801, whatever series classification you're going for. It's that standard baseline academy. So you go through that, and that's where you learn everything from handcuffing to arrest procedures to law, everything that it takes to become an officer and agent, you learn there. Once you graduate the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, a majority of the graduates go directly into the field. They get their badge at graduation. They go back to their different organizations and their law enforcement officials. Not the Secret Service. We get to go through another academy. So we get to go through really the Secret Service Academy, which is held. The academy is the Raleigh Training Center in Beltsville, Maryland, and that's where you learn the trade craft of actually being a Secret Service agent or officer. You learn about the core investigative responsibilities. So you learn about uh, credit card fraud, bank fraud, all crimes against the treasury. You learn how to make counterfeit currency, how to detect genuine from fake Federal Reserve notes.
Let me
There's a
press
lot.
pause right there, John, because you are
Mhm.
right there going to throw some listeners for a curve, because
Sure.
Secret Service in the public imagination is Kevin Costner, former Secret Service protective agent in The Bodyguard, or Clint Eastwood in The Line of Fire. You're talking about, or the films of John F. Kennedy. You're talking about protecting the president and perhaps others. And you're talking about counterfeit currency.
Sure.
You're going to have to explain that history a bit before you go on.
Absolutely. So the Secret Service was first and foremost formed as an investigative entity, formed to combat counterfeit currency. It wasn't until later on in the agency's history that they started doing protective assignments, protecting presidential candidates, the president of the United States, and it's expanded since then. But today, the Secret Service is the only federal law enforcement entity with a dual mission. They have a protective mission, which is exactly what you had described. It is the women and men, dark sunglasses, dark suit, earpiece, stoic looking that you see surrounding protectees on the television all the time. The side that most people don't understand is that we have an investigative mission, and that investigative mission today does include financial crimes, so any crimes against the Treasury, also electronic crimes, so electronic fraud that's occurring every single day. That's now a core component and an emerging component of the Secret Service. So the dual mission, the investigative and the protective, is always a challenge for Secret Service agents because you have to have a balance. It's very difficult to work a very complex financial fraud case and do protection because you have to prioritize one over the other somehow.
Right.
Protection always wins, by the way,
Right.
but it's hard to do that balance. But that's what makes the job so interesting. And I go back to listening to those agents in the stairwell prior to me ever becoming an agent, and listening to their interest. Like they'd be standing in a stairwell talking about these investigative cases that they were working.
Good
They'd
security.
talk about, yeah, exactly. But it to me, it was like, wait a second, this isn't just a single scope job.
Mhm.
This is a real, like every single day is really interesting. And it wasn't until I had passed through the academies that I started to live and breathe that. But so hopefully that answers the why I was talking about the counterfeit in terms of tradecraft. But tradecraft also is on the protective side. There's
Right.
a protective model that
Mhm.
Secret Service agents train on, and that takes a lot of time. It's a lot of repetition. It's a lot of very coordinated movements in terms of how do we execute on our mission. And as I talked about a little bit earlier about my commentary on CNN about like preparedness, the left of boom preparedness allows me to
Yeah.
be able to respond in kind to an incident on the air. That's the Secret Service model. They actually train and train and train for every eventuality and prepare for everything that could happen in terms of a protective construct, whether it's a tactical, medical, or relocation scenario, constantly train on that. And there's a very stringent model that the Secret Service follows in terms of not being able just to react to something, but proactively mitigate threats and vulnerabilities through an
Right.
advanced process. So
Yeah.
that second academy is jam packed. It's 6 months. It probably should be a year to really be able to garner all of the knowledge that you need to be able to go directly into the field. But
Mhm.
it is where the tradecraft is learned. And the great thing about the Secret Service is that training doesn't end on the day that you graduate.
Yeah.
It really continues through your entire career.
Now, you told me several years ago, we talked at length about this for my second book about how presidents leave office. And the most awkward chapter to write was that presidents sometimes leave office by violent means. And
Mhm.
it's not to laud that, not to recommend that, but simply to note that it has happened. And you said that all of the growth around the protection of the president, all of the policies and procedures are born out of blood. That is, the experiences that the Secret Service directly has had,
Mhm.
often some of the biggest growths in procedures, policies, ways of investigating, but ways of protecting in advance, are from tragedies They're from the experiences of presidents mostly, but other detailees, other protectees, who have actually shed blood as a result of some failure which was not anticipated correctly. Is that a part of that initial 6 months training, or is that something that's done in more advanced studies to kind of build those lessons of history in?
Everything is a building block. It starts in the academy. Start understanding why, why is the president in a ballistic vehicle? Why isn't the president in, an open air car? Well, you go back to the Kennedy administration, learned a very tragic lesson there. Again, that's one of those elements that a tactic that was born out of blood. We're never going to put the president in an open air vehicle again, where they are susceptible to that long range threat if we can't control the entire 360-degree environment around them. So, we look at things. You learn that as a baseline. Like, we deploy a very specific protective methodology. You have to understand, where did that methodology come from? Why are we doing it? Because when you take it and apply it to the streets of Washington, D.C., the streets of Seattle, or some foreign location that the president is going to, you have to understand and wholly appreciate why we're applying this model to be successful, right? We want to manipulate the environment. We want to make sure that we always have the advantage. We, meaning the Secret Service, the protective model, always has the advantage over any type of adversary. And it's an adversary we don't know how they're going to attack us. So we have to think about every single type of attack that could be launched on a site and put those control measures into place. But again, it all comes back to the history, understanding why we don't have the press or the public close to the president. Why? Well, you could have a squeaky fromm issue. Why do you see the agents constantly holding the doors of the limousine open? Why? Because we learned a lot of lessons from President Ford when he was shot. Every single tactic that we deploy today has a history. There's a lineage back to why are we doing this, and we're constantly getting better. Right? You can either sit back and wallow in a mistake or an issue that had happened in the past, or you can get better from it. And I think that's what makes the Secret Service so great, is that they're constantly trying to improve. And one of a former supervisor said to me, he used this phrase that said, "Complacency kills." And it has stuck with me forever. And he said, like, never allow complacency to enter into your protective model. Always question everything. Even if we go to the same site time and time again, we know the people that are there. The blueprint of the building hasn't changed. Never take anything for granted. Assume nothing. Go in like it's a new site. Relearn everything, because guaranteed you'll go in and see something you've never seen before. Threats will take the path of least resistance, and they'll keep pressure testing sites and localities to find that least resistance. You have to make sure that you find it first and mitigate it, so a threat doesn't exploit that vulnerability.
Yeah, it's really interesting looking at it across the long span of time, because you're right. You can see that the kinds of transportation used now weren't true for Kennedy, for example, right? You don't see a lot of open air. When you do, it's very rare. When Jimmy Carter gets out and starts walking on the parade route, you're like, oh crap, that's that we've learned that we don't want to have visibility from all angles. But sometimes they take some time. So Abraham Lincoln in 1865 shot in the back of a head with an unguarded door. Now, the Secret Service was not doing protection at the time, so it's not a lesson the Secret Service learned, except you learned about that when you were going through training. But you go, 15 years, 16 years later, and James Garfield is shot walking into the railroad station with the Secretary of State arm in arm. And then, about 20 years later, McKinley is shot and killed at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, when people just come up and shoot him. So 3 presidents assassinated before the Secret Service actually takes over protection for a president. So there's definitely a learning curve on the part of the entire U.S. government there, if not the Secret Service, right?
Correct. Well, the learning curve there should have been a little bit faster, but it wasn't. But you have to understand, like, those those attacks are, studied and reviewed
Mhm.
constantly. I mean, through my entire career, we probably looked at the Lincoln assassination in depth like 6 or 7 times. Like,
Mm.
how did it happen? Like, where were their failures? Because there was some notional security at the theater, but like, what was the chain of events that happened
Right.
beforehand? What
Mhm.
happened afterwards? Because you gotta think, just because you have an attack doesn't mean that the protectee is getting killed instantaneously.
Yeah.
They could be wounded. So how do you what are those next steps that you do to provide the medical care? We look all the way back at every single instance where a protectee ever got hurt.
Mhm.
Did we
Mhm.
do the right thing there? So you're constantly evolving and refining your protective model and how or what control measures you're putting into place, and then what reactionary measures do you need to have ready should something occur.
Right. Yeah, the open air car still surprises me because Franklin Roosevelt was attacked sitting in the back of an open car with Mayor Cermak from Chicago. Um, and it was still what, almost 30 years, and Kennedy is shot in an open car.
Mhm.
Now, part of that's because of the personality of the presidents. Protectees don't always want to do the safest thing. They want to do the thing because they're politicians first and targets second. They want to do the thing that connects them to the people, whether that's ride in an open air so you can wave and be seen, or whether that's jump out of the car and walk along Pennsylvania Avenue. So there's always going to be that tension. But it's got to feel funny looking at those historical stories. The things, anything more than 50 years ago seems like some kind of ancient age. And it's not just because of the technology of weapons and tactics. It's because of the feeling of openness around the presidency, with people coming into the White House to appeal personally to the president for a job. The President Truman walking down the streets of Washington, D.C., and anybody could come up and talk to him, versus now. It almost seems like a different world.
It seems like a different world. Let's go back to the Kennedy um, assassination for just one moment. Those agents at the time, they were thinking of the threat environment in a more micro sense, in like that immediate uh, area surrounding the president and
Right.
protectee.
Right.
They were not thinking of they didn't calculate the probability of a long range
Hmm.
shot
Yeah.
coming beyond their, like, in an area that they can't mitigate. Like, that wasn't in their risk assessment,
Yeah.
because they were playing to the environment. Like, the vehicle is moving fast, or no one's going to be able to take that shot. Wait, like that. That's just not feasible. They didn't know what they didn't know at the time. Now they know.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to think about, like, that's what makes the job so challenging today, is that agents and officers over index on the history in learning about like what had happened, which now necessitates you to go through every single type of eventuality
Hmm.
when you're building a protective structure for a location that the president or vice president may go to. I mean, you're thinking, if you're going to any place on the West Coast, there are earthquake plans that need to be
Yep.
put into place. There's just things that agents even 15, 20 years ago weren't even thinking about. um, the attack of drones today, electronic countermeasures that maybe try to use against the um, against communications. So there's a lot of things that now, like, you can anticipate, but
Hmm.
what don't you know? So that's what makes the job so challenging today, is that these threat factors that could impact you
Yeah.
are so numerous, right? It's just a lot to try to be able to handle and execute on.
It is, and it over time creates one hell of a checklist. I mean, I remember dating myself going back more than 20 years when I was overseas, helping out in an embassy, and there was a former president visiting. And of course, the advanced team comes out, probably not the only one, but the advanced team comes out and is going through, literally minute by minute and literally inch by inch, the movements and the positions of the former president for various public and semi-public appearances and activities. And the one that sticks with me, which is no secret, there's nothing being given away here, but the one that just sticks in my mind is for a semi-public event, which would have some screening of visitors, and they were all friendly, very senior members of government and things. There was a riser. There was like a podium for people to sit on and make small speeches from, but there were seats for people when they weren't speaking. And I remember one of your colleagues pulling me aside, because I was just the closest person physically, and pointing at the chair and saying, that chair needs to be forward a few inches. I said, what, why? He said, well, it's too close to the back of the riser. I said, well, actually it's not close to the back of the riser. And he just looked at me with a look with all knowing confidence and said, move it forward. It's too close to the back of the riser, and put tape where it's supposed to be in case someone else comes along. And that didn't sound to me, and in this case it was a man, but this didn't sound to me like a man who was making a snap judgment. This sounded to me like a man who was going through a 384 point checklist. And one of those was, make damn sure that your protectee doesn't slip off the back of a riser, for God's sakes. You're worried about snipers. You're worried about air routes. You're worried about evacuation plans. But you really don't want your person to slip and fall on something obvious. And you really don't want your person to sit down and have the chair go out from under him or her. And that really quickly gave me the lesson that there are a whole lot of incidents that must have happened, many of which didn't reach public knowledge, but led to this hundreds long checklist of all the things that absolutely must be done in every scenario to prevent an avoidable mistake.
Well, it's an avoidable mistake, but it's, when you think about the way, protectors need to look at their protectees, you're protecting them from physical harm first and foremost, but you're also protecting them from embarrassment, right? Like,
Right.
You're spending so much time at that site. You've been to so many events that are almost cookie cutter of, what can go wrong. And, there are other things with, I've been in arguments with advanced staff members where they didn't want hand railings on like 3 steps.
Right on. Yeah.
And it doesn't look good. The optic is horrible.
The political team, the media team hates it, right?
Everyone hates it. It says, okay, but this person, is going to run out, especially if it's a campaign stuff. They're going to run out. They're waving to the crowd. They have no idea where that first step is, but they know where that railing is.
Yeah.
So they're always going to index to the railing so they can take that first step up and jump onto up into the dais and start waving and doing their political stuff.
Yeah.
We know that because we've also seen what happens when that railing isn't there and they make a misstep or they stumble onto stage. That doesn't matter what that person says for the next 45 minutes. Press are already focused on, Obama stumbles in Iowa. And it's like, wait a second, that's, he stumbled on stage. You forgot the rest of the sentence, but you would protect them from embarrassment.
Let's talk about a couple of specific examples, things that happened within recent memory of you starting that were certainly a part of training and perhaps lessons being more strongly learned at the time you started because they were so recent. One is the near assassination of Ronald Reagan in 1981. What is the main lesson regarding events and egress and access that came from the Reagan assassination that by the time you came on board were just a part of standard procedure for making sure that people were not as vulnerable as he was that day?
Well, so a couple things that had occurred on that day that again goes back to that the theory of policies and procedures born out of blood. One, we had the crowd too close. So his arrival and departure point was way too close. We were allowing public to come way too close to that arrival departure point. Ever since that day, all arrivals and departures by the president are done out of sight of the public. So you'll see all the time tents set up in, or preferably go underground or into garages where we control that entire 360 degrees. You don't know what's going on inside that tent or what's going on underground. So that is something that had come into play. But you have to take a step back and talk about like what was something that was successful, but was born out of blood from earlier. And you look at the way that the Secret Service agents reacted to the sound of gunfire.
Right.
And
Right.
when you watch the video
Yeah.
there, you will see police officers and others shrinking down
Yeah.
because that's their training.
Right.
What did you see the Secret Service agents do? They got big. They
Yeah.
stood up.
Mm-hmm.
They became that human shield, not even understanding where the gunfire may have been coming from, but they just got big to protect the president.
Right.
Other things that were very successful in the door was open.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I talked about that before with Ford.
Hard to
They
throw
had
the
learned
president in if the door is closed.
Exactly. In this instance, seconds counted. The seconds mattered to the survivability of the president. So again, there were lessons that were learned on that day that now are just part of that standard nomenclature for advanced sites. But there were a lot of successes that were then codified into, you know what, we
Right.
made the right call by implementing this. Learning and understanding the routes to the hospital, who makes that call on
Yeah.
going to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Like why is that done? Well, it's done because agents now have a significant level of medical training.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody does as a baseline. It's not just first aid. You become first responders. You understand, advanced life support. You know how critical the medical aspect of the job is. So a lot of things were net new. We learned a lot of net new lessons in 81, but we also reaffirmed some of the policies that were just implemented a few years beforehand.
That's funny. As you said that about the rising up and the medical preparation beyond just pure first aid. I was recalling a few years ago, I was at an event, a conference, and a colleague of mine, she was there with her husband, who was an active Secret Service protective agent, and didn't advertise the fact, but it became clear, and we ended up chatting about it quite a bit. And at one point during the event, it's a cocktail hour atmosphere, and people are standing around and all this, and all of a sudden, probably about 40 feet away, maybe 35, 40 feet away, someone starts choking, and it's not the polite cough that happens. It's a gagging, strenuous cough, as if there's a serious choking incident. And I just remember standing there. Maybe it's because he was in my line of sight to the incident, but I remember seeing him immediately, shoulders went higher, and you could see him almost start to move towards it, that he was looking there. And I think his eyes, and I'm not sure this was conscious, but his eyes were almost assessing the situation. Do I need to provide medical aid immediately to this person? And he didn't. He held back, and sure enough, the coughing ended. But just that few seconds stuck with me as here's someone who is poised to jump on a potential threat instead of stand there looking around at other people. Hey, what do we do? Is this person choking? Does anyone know the Heimlich maneuver? This person was ready to get there as soon as there was a certain threshold of threat. And it sounds to me like that the Reagan incident really sealed that when it came to making a flash decision about, do we need to get to an advanced medical facility like a hospital instead of just doing something ourselves?
Correct. And it again, we look back in agents from the academy all the way through their career, look back in history to things that were successful, like what worked. And we train on that. We train on what was successful. We understand, listen, the protective, missteps and failures that had occurred were not intentional, but they happen. You have to get better from them. You have to learn from them, move forward. And that's how an organization evolves. If you don't do that, if you're not constantly doing the after action review of every aspect of your operation, then you become stagnant. You will never be able to keep pace with a constantly changing threat environment. You'll always lag. You will always lag. In the Secret Service, thankfully, they take that proactive step to constantly ask themselves, how do we get better? How do we get better on protection? How do we get better on investigations?
Right.
What do we need to do to match this new and evolving threat environment?
Let me jump forward to something that would not have come up in your training, because this would have come up when you were actually on the job working personal protection in the Obama White House. You had a couple of incidents during the administration there that also thankfully did not lead to a worst case scenario, but they were considered failures at the time and did lead to some changed methodology. One is, and I'm not sure if you were there for this one, but in 2011, when the shots actually hit the White House windows, as I recall, the president and first lady were not there, but at least one daughter was there. And it was not, in fact, known for sure at the time that the shots did hit the window and the plaster around the window. You've described this and others as a scarring experience when it comes to the immediate reaction of the reporting and supervisory chain and everything else. But walk through that incident, if you will, and tell us kind of what the lesson is in terms of protection.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, like with that incident, there was a real lack of awareness that there was even an incident.
That's an
There
important
were
first
some,
step, isn't it?
yeah, you have to identify that there's a problem to be able to solve for it, or react to it. And I think that is where the initial breakdown had come into play, where you had individuals, and this situation is really complex, and it gets drawn out over months. But the initial incident distills down to um, officers who were at the White House heard rounds over their head. So they called out shots fired. Right call to make, by the way. The supervisors that were on duty, who were not there, discounted it as a different type of noise, not gunfire. Don't worry about it. Well, that was bad. And that delayed the response. It delayed the response to the defensive forces that were at the White House, but also it delayed the response of the mutual law enforcement partners in Washington, D.C., namely Metro PD, Park Police, from also immediately responding. Now, the suspect was eventually caught. And it from then on, our tactics again changed at the White House forever. But who would have thought that randomly someone would drive, down Constitution and just fire a, semi-automatic rifle at the White House? I mean,
Right.
it wasn't some in the heart of DC.
Didn't seem likely, but it's one of those things where you can explain away
Mhm.
almost anything as random gunfire from an unrelated incident nearby to
Mhm.
a backfire of a vehicle, because that was common enough in the area. But when you have an agent reporting shots fired, it's disturbing to think that any system could actually reject that and not respond to it as an immediate
Yeah.
threat.
And I think what the worst part of it was, as the service was trying to figure out what was going on, yeah, how do we message this internally? And it was a difficult moment. There was a lot of things going on for the service. What we failed to remember was that the parents of these two young women who were at the White House at the time, we didn't notify them. They found out
Oof.
through other means.
Oh,
Now, and I use the words parents, not first lady, not president of the United States,
right.
because as a parent myself,
Yeah.
I know that if my child's life was ever in danger,
Yeah.
how I would react. I'm sure you feel the same way.
And because you worked closely with the first lady, you know that her reaction, which came afterwards, which was, I don't know, volcanic might be right, was
Yeah,
as a parent. It had nothing to do with the fact she was first lady.
exactly. So, there were the girls ever in danger? No. There's multiple levels of protection at the White House. Um, but that didn't matter, right? Because the mom wasn't notified, and yeah, there were some supervisors that got eviscerated, and they tried to explain what happened. A mother really doesn't want to hear that. They want to know
Yeah.
in the moment, like, what are we doing to better protect my kids?
Right.
Not the best moment, but This, again, you have to take
Mm-hmm.
that situation. Secret Service took its lumps, but then applied almost instantaneously a change in the protective methodology around the
Mm-hmm.
White House. Our area of responsibility bumped out significantly,
Mm-hmm.
and we weren't asking for we weren't asking permission to bump that perimeter out. We just did it out of necessity, and it holds true today.
Mm-hmm. You talk about multiple layers of security there, and that's why it's even more disturbing that just 3 years later you had a different incident that questioned that, because without going into the technology and the different systems, it is safe to assume as an outside analyst that there are a variety of technological and non-technological measures of perimeter security, multiple perimeter security around a place like the White House. And yet in 2014, a knife wielder found his way not only onto the grounds beyond some of those means, but literally inside the building. That's a slap across the face. Thankfully, there was no, slap across the face with a knife. I'm not being direct. I'm saying as an institution, that's really hard when you have taken such pride in the lessons learned from previous security incidents, to suddenly have someone with a knife who gets in the door and is inside the building.
Yeah, that's about as bad as it gets, right? That's hard to even explain. But you have to look at how did and there's no excuse for that happening, right? It should never have happened, full stop. But it did. So you have to look back at what were the precipitating events that led to that moment. And it actually started almost a year beforehand, when because of manpower constraints, they had to reallocate how personnel on the north lawn has to shift to the south lawn when there's a departure of the president. And just prior to this individual jumping over the fence,
right, there'd been a movement, right?
There had been a movement. The president left via the south grounds, and all of the focus was back to where the president was and securing that route of the helicopter out. It left the north grounds, I don't want to say fully vulnerable, but vulnerable, not as protected as it should be, as if the president was in residence. That allowed the individual to, one, get over the fence and close so much distance between the fence line and the main entrance to the north portico, because there wasn't the officers and agents weren't on the north grounds as they normally were, and more importantly, the counter snipers on the roof had been set up for the departure off the south ground. So that's a manpower issue. That was a decision that was made a long time beforehand, but then we saw the impact, the consequence of that decision. So that was one major issue. The second major issue is just human failure. Like, as you went through all of those layers of defense, that last layer of defense is that officer at the door. You do whatever you have to do to stop that threat from entering that
because
residence.
it happened to have been a knife, but it easily could have been an explosive device.
Could have been an explosive device. It could have been a myriad of things. But all you know is you have an inbound threat coming in. That individual, it was vapor lock. They didn't take the right actions. They didn't do the right thing to protect that house. Now, again, looking backwards, what did the embarrassing moment, first of all, but what did the Secret Service do? They took their lumps. They understood what was going on, what the problems were, and they rectified it. They made sure that that's not going to happen again, right? And it's everything from raising the level of fence. It took way too long, but they finally have raised the level of the fence. They've put different electronic means in terms of mitigation throughout the north lawn and into the building itself. They're still heavily reliant upon human capabilities, but it's also a matter of process and technology that's also aiding the protective model throughout the White House. So it changed. So again, they got better from it, not worse. They didn't just say, "Hey, it wasn't our fault," and moved on. They actually did look at how do we change the way that we operate to get better.
Right. And one of the actual assets in this protective process over a long period of time has been the apolitical nature of the Secret Service. It is not a partisan Praetorian Guard. The oath is not to the person based on political means. It is an oath to protecting the Constitution and the constitutional role of the president or the other protectee within it. So one of the threats to the Secret Service mission is actually politicization or the appearance of politicization. And in my experience, the strongest danger to this actually came during the last administration when you had things like a detail leader, Tony Amato, who was promoted to deputy chief of staff, a political appointee position, and then doing policy matters. And then things, of course, like the incident, June 1st, I think it was, 2020, when the Secret Service supported the U.S. Park Police in clearing out Lafayette Park of protesters so the president could have a photo op up the street a bit. Without getting specific as to some of the decisions made within the leadership of the Secret Service, do you fear that there's a slippery slope there, that even allowing the appearance of politicization gets in the way of that mission, which requires the perception of pure objectivity unrelated to partisan motives?
Yes, because it goes to the motto: Secret Service is worthy of trust and confidence. Right? In the moment that trust and/or confidence is tainted in any way, it becomes very difficult for officers and agents to execute on their job. But what I look at is that I've thought a lot about Tony Honorato and other issues that the service was faced with during the Trump administration. And the way that I look at it is that the institution of the Secret Service is strong. Its culture runs really deep,
Mm-hmm.
and the morals and the ethics of every officer and agent that I know are of the highest regard. Now, we can get into a conversation about missteps around Colombia or things in the past, but I'm willing to debate that at any moment in time, because the women and men that I worked with held the core responsibility of protection above anything else, above politics. And I worked with Tony as well, so I know him and I can speak to this firsthand, that
Mm-hmm.
they hold executing the protective mission as a sacred duty, and they're not going to let politics get involved in it as a matter of process. Now, does it happen sometimes? Yes, it does. I mean, even in the micro sense, does it happen at protective sites for campaign sites? Yeah, it does, but it's not. It won't destroy the agency. It won't harm individuals. Moments in time are going to be looked at. I think Lafayette Park is a great example of, like, what did those officers and first line supervisors know, did not know? Where were they getting their information from? I still think that there's a lot more to come out about that. But the institution of the Secret Service, how they execute on their mission, moves forward. And I think you have to look at the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. There were a lot of articles in the Washington Post or whatever saying, like, can the Secret Service be trusted? Yes, they can.
Yep.
Those are the same women and men on Inauguration Day that were there 3 weeks beforehand with Trump.
Mm-hmm.
They're still there today.
Yeah.
Some of the supervisors change out, but it doesn't change who the Secret Service is as an entity. And I think that the director, who I don't know at all, I do respect this director immensely, because I think he's had a very challenging go at it.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of, like, how do you say that you're not political in a political environment? It's very difficult. And I think that the service has done a good job at trying to keep it at bay. But there's a lot of things that impact that. There's social media. And you can point to, like, well, this Secret Service employee posted something on Facebook. Okay. Or this Secret Service, agent's wife or husband is, posting this stuff online. It becomes very difficult. But I hold that the institution of the Secret Service remains apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
The mission hasn't changed. The mission is always going to be apolitical. You play to the individual that's in the office, and you literally, that's your job, is to keep them alive, whether they're
Right.
Republican, Democrat, Independent, doesn't matter. So the politicalization just makes the job more challenging. It becomes detractive to the mission. But I don't think it's become such an issue that you need any type of systematic change to the way that the service operates. And I have full confidence in what they're doing today.
It's been a while, perhaps since the Kennedy assassination, that there's been with one exception, which is during the Clinton years, that there's been a dramatic issue involving the Secret Service agents specifically having the duty to testify in a judicial hearing or some kind of investigation, and that being a dilemma because of the need to be discreet, and the Secret Service agents needing to be close enough that they sometimes hear things that they wish they hadn't heard or have to pretend they never heard. So in the Clinton years, it had to do with, do you have to testify? Does an agent have to testify in a case where the agent may have heard something that is directly relevant to a legal claim? And then most recently, it came up in the January 6th hearings, where the Secret Service that was there with the vice president clearly did not want to talk about where they were they even on the Capitol grounds during some of the time there. And then in the hearings, it comes out that, well, in fact, yes, they were in a certain location on the Capitol grounds during a tense time. Talk us through the tension there, both in terms of the training you receive and the lessons you learned on the job, in terms of how you deal with, on the one hand, you must be close enough to the protectee that you're going to see and hear things that are beyond official duties and things that maybe you don't want to see. On the other hand, you are subject to the laws of the United States. And if it is determined you must testify as to something, you have to do that, notwithstanding number one. How do you think through that when you're actually on the job, beyond crossing your fingers and hoping that nothing happens that you would be called to testify about?
Yeah. So I think that it's interesting because I've had people ask me the same thing. And it goes back to the trust and confidence of the protectee is really how we can execute on our job. Meaning we get very close to them. They have to, and we ask a lot of them. We ask for access into the most private moments of their life. When staff is not around, when White House, support staff or residential staff are not around, the people left standing are the Secret Service agents and members of the family. And you have a front row seat to everything that is good and everything that is bad in their life. Now, I always took it as, if a husband and wife protectee are having a real sensitive conversation, a husband and wife protectee are having a real sensitive conversation in front of you, you've done your job correctly, because you've garnered their trust that they can have a very private conversation, and it may be a very tense private conversation, but they can hold it in front of you, knowing that you are not going to disclose that conversation. Now, and I think that's the worries that the protectees have, or that are you going to talk about how the president comes down and eats breakfast in his underwear every morning? Like, that's that's salacious stuff. No one that could sell a million books, but that's not going to, like, I don't need to testify about that.
Yeah.
The other side is, if you're compelled to testify because there's some sort of crime that is being investigated,
right?
Well, you have a duty as well to the Constitution of the United States. You have a duty as a law enforcement officer or agent to testify in a court of law pursuant to a criminal matter.
Right.
I think where we've seen pushback in the past is where that testimony would lead to embarrassment. And I look back to the Clinton administration. But if you look at what's happening now, every Secret Service agent that was asked to testify in front of the January 6th commission have done so without a subpoena.
Right.
They've done so under their own free will.
Yep.
They've done so outside of the counsel of the Secret Service.
Mm.
Why? Because they know that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Even including testimony by the detail leader,
Yeah.
by President Trump's detail leader,
Mm-hmm.
all of it being additive to the story and piecing things together, but not embarrassing. Like nothing has
Right.
been embarrassing. I think the issue with the vice president's detail is the reluctance to even talk about it is because through that conversation, what would you reveal? You would reveal the safe haven
Mm-hmm.
that's designated at the Capitol. Now, guess what? That's not the safe haven anymore. Someplace else will be built out. But that's why there's a reluctance. It's not to
It's not to
try to
protect
hide anything.
secrets.
It's part of It's to actually to protect the protective methodology.
Yeah. Fair enough. John, we've gotten this far in the conversation without going to the obvious question, right? In the hearings, the Secret Service and its interactions with the president were not quite front and center because there were some other issues involving, weapons and attempted coups. But there was the story told of the president disagreeing so dramatically with his security detail that it led to actual potentially assault. And I know enough about Secret Service history, in part from talking to you, from the excellent book Zero Fail by Carol Leonnig, that there have been cases, certainly Johnson, Kennedy, Nixon, of presidents who have disregarded the recommendations of their security, and the Secret Service has been frustrated by some movements the president would insist upon. But I certainly don't recall any cases that were this direct, that were this physical. And I'm wondering if you can talk through a little bit of that from your experience. Just how unusual would this be if the facts bear out, and what kind of dynamics between the protectee and the protectors play into this?
Well, it's interesting because you raise some interesting points around Kennedy and Nixon, and then Johnson as well, around disagreements. But it goes back to what I said earlier, that the protective methodology by the Secret Service was born out of blood. So over time, that methodology gets refined. It gets sharpened to the point of being able to anticipate those threats and vulnerabilities and
Mhm.
mitigating them before you even have to have those arguments. But as we have seen and heard recently, there still is conflict when you have individuals, protectees, who want to get out into the public domain to push some type of message, right? And typically we see that during a campaign, whether it's a presidential candidate or even a sitting president who's trying to get reelected on a reelection campaign. You see that they have a strong desire to have more public availability, be seen as being more in touch with everybody. And the way that they do that is they want to get out into the crowd and be with people. Now,
Right.
that is in complete contrast to what the Secret Service actually wants. They want a very stringent security structure set up in concentric circles around that protectee, 360 degrees in all directions. So there's going to always be this push and pull between protectees, in this case, let's just say the president and their staff, and the security apparatus, whether it's the Secret Service, local law enforcement, everything. You have to find that right balance. But at the end of the day, the Secret Service today, unlike what Johnson, Kennedy, Nixon, and some of the issues in the past, Secret Service today has to be beholden to a threat-based methodology when it comes to protection. Because as we talked about before, the threat environment today is so dynamic, it's so unpredictable, it's violent, that you have to have a standard operating model to go off of that is not influenced by politics, is not influenced by individuals or media or optics or anything like that. Because the moment you start doing that, the moment that you start wavering off that threat-based methodology, you actually inherently create an intrinsic vulnerability, and that's not what you want. You want to make sure that your
Right.
process day in and day out is the same. So what did we hear in the testimony? We heard that there was an argument or disagreement between the president and the special agent in charge of the Secret Service on that day as to whether or not the president can go, whether march or drive or just be present at the U.S. Capitol.
Hmm.
Now, there's a little bit of disagreement as to what happened in that vehicle. We
Hmm.
do know that through previous testimony there was a disagreement
Hmm.
between the service and the president of the United States, but that's not uncommon. We just don't know the level that that disagreement raised to. Now, it was raised in testimony that the president was so angry that he lunged at a steering wheel. There was a material statement that the president potentially assaulted the special agent in charge.
Hmm.
All of that will come out. Those are nuanced issues that will come out in testimony because it's easy. You can bring those agents in and get the factual representation of what happened. But what I think is being missed in that back and forth is the fact that there was a disagreement. I don't think that that is being disputed, and that the protective model that the Secret Service applies actually worked, right?
Hmm.
Because as angry as the president and his staff or others may have been that the Secret Service wasn't immediately going to acquiesce and bring the president to the US Capitol, as angry as they were, the special agent in charge and other Secret Service representatives held true to the methodology in the way that they conduct themselves and didn't allow for the president to get put into harm's way, even if it was self-induced, even if he was riling up the crowd. And as much as he says they're not here for me, they're not going to hurt me. Well, we don't know that. That's an
A,
assumption. So
yeah, a crowd can get out of control. Sure.
exactly. So I think that this should be seen as a success, that the protective model works for the Secret
Yep.
Service. Now, it makes for like shocking testimony to hear that the president was lunging. I'm sure there was a lot of verbal tongue lashing in that vehicle. And I've seen protectees get upset when they don't get what they want or
Yeah.
things are not going their way. But that's okay, right? We're not there to be their best friends. Secret Service isn't there to appease everybody and make everybody happy all the time. They're there for a very specific reason. One
Hmm.
is obviously the most notable is to make sure that that individual is safe and secure. But there's also a bigger construct here, and I think that I'd be interested over time to go back to the special agent in charge, Bobby Engel, and get his thoughts on this. But
Hmm.
it's also the Secret Service protects the office of the presidency. There's a continuity issue here that's bigger than the individual. And I think that that's the way when I was an agent, we always looked at protection in terms of how do we, it's protecting the individual, but the office of the presidency at the same time. The office of the presidency is something bigger. And I think that that's an important construct because to me, it was always an overarching justification for these security measures that we put around political leadership.
Now that gets to the question that often pops up on people's minds, having to do with doing what the president says.
Mhm.
As a general rule, in the executive branch, you work for the president of the United States in any agency or department.
Mhm.
And if the president issues a directive that is not illegal, that is, it is in correspondence with the Constitution and the laws of the United States, then in general you follow it unless it raises an ethical, non-legal, but an ethical issue that you personally cannot carry out. So the president says, I want to give a speech saying this. If that's a legal speech to give, then normally you would go along with it, but a cabinet official may decide to resign because they don't agree with the ethics of it. The Secret Service is in a slightly different position, but similar, which is the president says, I want to go to the Capitol. That is a legal directive. There is nothing against the Constitution or the laws of the United States saying, drive me, down Constitution Avenue or down Pennsylvania Avenue, depending on where he is, and get me closer to the Capitol. But it clashes with the mission and the oath of the Secret Service to protect this person and, as you said, the institution. So it sounds to me like you're saying that the special agent in charge could, in a sense, overrule the president on a wish. And the president says, you will take me there. And the special agent in charge says, no, sir, I will not. Does that sound right in an extreme situation?
Yes, it is right. And I think you have to look back at 18 USC 3056, which is the guiding statute of the Secret Service. We're mandated by Congress to provide the protection of the President of the United States by statute. So here we have, you're right, we're part of the executive branch. You're taking a direct order, but we also cannot violate the statute that we are beholden to. And at the end of the day, this is going to come down to a life safety issue. If there's a clear and present life safety issue, which I have seen before, I have seen the President of the United States say, I am not doing X. And because of exigent circumstances, the detail leader at the time and the shift leaders were like, yes, you are. Either you're going to do it on your own, or we're physically going to make you do it.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too much into that, but I witnessed that firsthand. Shocking moment for the president to realize someone for the first time probably was telling them no. But that was based upon a life safety issue. Afterwards, the president fully understood what was going on, why that decision was made. But the Secret Service tries its best to not get into situations where decisions may seem political or guided by any other principle other than a life safety issue. And the way that they do that is they try to get ahead of problems, work with staff, try to build a consensus around, hey, this is what we want to make this decision. This is our recommendation. We're not going to do X, Y, and Z because these are the threats. This is what we've identified. This is what we cannot mitigate. And a lot of times that happens in a foreign country. Those conversations, because we don't control the environment. We're actually beholden to other people. So, but I have seen it. But you try to work through those difficulties to make sure that you're able to not get to the point where you have a protectee and the detail leader arguing and having that disagreement.
Yeah, and I sounds like there's a real difference between a scheduled event and something that comes up in the heat of the moment, right? So if the president had on his schedule that day, I want to drive, we're going to drive near the Capitol, there would have been advance work, there would be measures set up, there would be that 360 concentric issue that you talked about. But all of a sudden just saying, turn the wheel, we're going Capitol Hill, it sounds like the mission of the Secret Service under those circumstances, given the threat, would not let them do that.
Correct. Yeah, and listen, I think this shows, that the training, the tactics, and experience of the Secret Service leadership on that day prevailed. Why? Because they didn't make that decision not to go based upon anything other than the intelligence, that tactical intelligence that they were receiving near real time. I mean, they're hearing the police radio saying, man with a gun in the tree, arrest being made. Like, they know just beyond the fence line, there are individuals, whatever their intent may or may not have been, that there were individuals with weapons. No agent in their right mind, even if it's a crowd that, loves the protectee, thinks that they are, the almost godlike. It doesn't matter. There is still an unmitigated threat that no agent will ever put the president or any protectee into that environment. It's just counter to what we do. You do it once, you break that methodology, right? You break that protective methodology.
Yeah.
And so I think that on January 6th, the Secret Service was tested. And they proved that the model worked. And I think that time will tell. That I think the story will evolve. I think the distractions of did he lunge for the wheel, not lunge for the wheel, all of that will resolve itself. But I think history will tell that on that day, the Secret Service, the leadership, and it really came down to one person. They were really tested, and everything that agents trained for years in that one moment in time, like it came to fruition right there and then,
Hmm.
and it worked. And yes, you have the president who's really upset, right? That was a seminal moment. That was his, his last stand to go to Congress and try to get his presidency back, right? That was, he wanted this grand, gesture, this grand moment, and he didn't get it. I think about like the pressure in the seconds before the special agent in charge had to make that decision,
Hmm.
but I know he made it with a clear rationale because he knew the consequences. He knew like the likelihood that something would go wrong, and he knew the consequences when it did.
Understood. Well, let's turn and apply all of this to, what many people fear is becoming a period of uptick in violence. Obviously, some of that is in just the statistics. There has been, if not a wave, at least a trend towards more things like mass shootings at schools. We've got that, and other issues in society overall, but also some negative trend lines regarding political violence and the possibility of fault lines across many societal issues exploding into actual physical conflict. The Secret Service has a lot of experience with both, predicting threats, investigating potential threats, mitigating against threats, and ultimately responding to threats. Is there a way that some of that methodology and some of those experiences born in blood could actually be transferred to the general public for personal security or to other institutions like schools and churches without jeopardizing the mission of the Secret Service itself?
Well, yes, and this isn't. There's no secrets here on this. The Secret Service has a division called the National Threat Assessment Center that puts out publicly available information in tools and resources to help mitigate these exact the list that you just put forth. There's mitigation tools and awareness around issues of mass shooting, mass violence, school shootings. How do you take the methodology of threat mitigation that the Secret Service has? So that's in terms of identifying a threat,
Hmm.
putting the right control measures into place, early intervention, so that potential threat doesn't metastasize into something that leads to violent acts.
Hmm.
The Secret Service spent a lot of time coming up with these models and share it. And they share it publicly in their resources for
Hmm.
corporate institutions, houses of worship, schools. There's a bunch of resources available that the Secret Service loves to share. Why? Because it's in their best interest. If we can start taking what we know and applying that to different aspects of our community, that could then reduce acts of violence. Every Secret Service in the agency would go out every single day and preach that, but we don't have to because the National Threat Assessment Center has put together these really, really remarkable pieces of content that are so additive right now in the world that we're living in. It's just being able to execute on those models within the community and getting the buy-in on it. And it's thinking about, this isn't about mental health. This is really thinking about behavior and early identification of behavioral anomalies that we can address, whether it's in the workplace, in a educational environment, or even in a house of worship. What are those? What are behavioral anomalies that we need to key in on, understand them, and then how do we provide the right resources to, so that behavior that is questionable doesn't continue on the continuum to violent acts.
Let's talk about the personal side too. So let's
Mhm,
say that you are um, just a citizen concerned, or perhaps a parent of children, and
mhm,
you're concerned about the rise of school violence, or you're concerned about the possibility of peaceful protests that you happen across or even participate in, becoming a source of violence from counter protesters or from kind of a mob mentality. What are some things that you have learned from how to protect, how to help protectees get out of situations like that and not become a victim that can apply to people in their personal life? What are the things to watch for that people should do to protect themselves and people around them from violence out there in society that can get out of control?
Well, what I tell everybody is we're living in a very unique threat environment where it's dynamic, it's unpredictable. The shootings are out of control, but just in terms of violent behavior by individuals walking down the street. You walking down the street in New York City these days, you see individuals lashing out at others, trying to punch and kick, and we're living in a really unique moment, and it necessitates that everybody have an elevated level of situational awareness. And what I mean by that is take that 1 second to understand what's going on around you as you enter into a new environment. When you walk out of a building, take a quick look left and right. It takes a fraction of a second to understand, like, is there a street fight going on? Is there somebody that I should be concerned with across the street? Understand the environment that you're going into and have some sort of notional plan as to what would you do if X happened. If I'm walking to from my office to Grand Central Station and gunfire starts happening on the street, what would I do? And the thought here is to get people thinking in advance of a crisis, because the moment to think about, like, oh, what am I going to do if someone starts shooting a gun, isn't in the moment of someone shooting a gun. Have some sort of personal plan that you can react to or get in that mindset. But it all comes down to situational awareness, understanding the world around you. And that's become so difficult these days because everyone is buried into their phone. I've watched the video of the Brooklyn subway shooting, and the immediate aftermath is the smoke is clearing inside the subway car. There were people who were still seated on their phone,
Still looking.
or texting or doing something. They were so focused on that little box
Yeah.
that they didn't get their ass up out of the seat
Yep.
to flee the threat environment.
Right on.
And to me, it's shocking, but you see it constantly
Mm-hmm.
where people are just heads down. They have the blinders on, but the environment around us necessitates us to take a look up,
Mm-hmm.
look around for a moment, operate more in like a condition yellow, where you have an elevated sense of what's going on around you,
Mm-hmm.
and you're able to build in a little bit of agility into being able to react if something does occur. Right? This isn't saying, hey, every time you walk out, like, have this big tactical plan in place and this is what you're going to do exactly. You can't plan for that kabuki dance. You just have to play to the environment, understand the environment, and then have some sort of plan in place should something occur. You're not
Mhm.
caught off guard. You're not shocked or stunned to like an acute incident, and you're able to react to the best that you can.
Yeah. Where do you stand on the issue of realistic drills for elementary schools on active shooters? Because there's been a trend over the last few years, and it's been useful for risk security professionals, that schools have advanced training for teachers and regular drills for students on, in the case of an active shooter, you run, hide, fight, and here's specific ways you do it, and let's analyze the school and have everybody walk through scenarios. And yet, even with the increased number of incidents and horrific incidents, you still have an infinitesimal chance of any individual being in one of those scenarios. And does the psychological damage to a 5, 6, 7-year-old of going through that, and the possibility of giving some children ideas about doing that, is that in fact a greater risk than somebody not having gone through a drill? What's the balance there?
Well, what you don't want to do is you don't want to broker in fear, right? If I start invoking fear through training, then the elements of what I'm trying to get across are going to be lost. So this is about the delivery of training, For elementary and middle school students, there's no need for them to go through any type of dynamic training where,
Yeah. They're running
individuals
from
with
a presumed
guns,
shooter. Yeah.
yeah. We don't light trash cans on fire to do a fire drill, right? What do?
Hmm.
We're able to contextualize, hey, this
Yeah.
is the danger, but this is what you need to do. And what do we do? Let's do it calmly. Let's do this. We repeat it. There are ways to do that without invoking fear for active shooters, hostile assailants, a multitude of things, but it's all in the delivery. I think that because the nature of hostile intruders and active shooters are so dynamic, right? In a second everything changes. That we have this thought that we have to practice like we're going to play one day, right? Like we have to practice in this dynamic environment. But David, you have small children. I do as well, and they their ability to digest that and then retain the teaching elements are finite,
Yeah.
and you have to just walk them through very simply. This is what you're going to do, even if this is what you're going to do is listen to this teacher
Yeah.
or listen to this announcement or go here until somebody helps you. Every school is different, so it's not like you can say this is the structure, but we have to have a delivery method of training that makes it understood by the lowest common denominator, and everyone's operating off the same sheet of music. That we're not creating anxiety through training. Otherwise, they're going to get turned off by it.
Yeah. And there's anxiety for adults too. I shouldn't
Mhm.
minimize that. My wife and I helped with my son's previous school, talking through a lot of their staff and teachers on, some of these very basic security measures.
Mhm.
And you could tell there was some palpable anxiety. I mean, the words weren't
Yeah.
said, but there was a definite feeling of, people crossing their arms, getting nervous, saying, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think
Mhm.
about having to grab scissors or a pen or something in an ultimate case. And these are the adults. These are the authority figures in the room. These are not the, 6, 7, 8-year old, children having to try to
Mhm.
process the reality of something like that. So I think you're right. There's definitely a way of preparing for a scenario that doesn't involve traumatizing those involved
Mhm.
unnecessarily. Because as far as I know, there is no actual evidence showing that potentially traumatizing training is actually effective
Mhm.
in that scenario. Anybody can find an isolated incident. You can find an anecdote where it
Mhm.
really did seem to help in one case and an anecdote where it didn't. But in terms of a wealth of data that gives us confidence that putting hundreds, thousands, eventually millions of people through traumatized real life like training provides an ultimate benefit, we just don't have that yet. We don't know if that's going to be worth the definite cost to the psychology of adults and children alike, uh, to help against that, again, hopefully very small chance of an actual
Mhm.
incident.
Yeah, and I think I agree to all of that. I think that there was never an intent that the training would be would create trauma for children, but as a consequence it has. So we have to rethink the model, and I know that there are a lot of school districts that have rethought that model and apply a less dynamic approach, and they tier it to, it's not one training type of curriculum for all. It's tiered into different grade levels, the audiences, as you get more mature and you're able to understand the reality of what's going on. Maybe you add more context to why you're doing this type of training or doing this type of action. But it really has to be done where you're not brokering in fear. You're actually just going through
Mhm.
those. Listen, a building fire is extremely traumatic.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
smoke conditions, loss of sight, loss of breathing, like that. That can be very, but we don't talk, like we never talk about
Right.
all of those horrific elements of a building fire, the heat, the smoke conditions. um what we talk about is, okay, everyone line up, let's get out of the building quickly and efficiently, and
Yep.
we're going to go to this rallying point. And I'm distilling this down, so hopefully people don't
Yep.
criticize my comments here. But it's not that we don't broker in the fear there, so we shouldn't have to do it with a hostile intruder, even though those are very traumatic incidents. We
Mhm.
don't have to pressure test our youngest children to
Right.
that environment every day.
What about the political violence side of it? So the obvious answer from a pure risk professional point of view is,
Mhm,
if there is a large protest going on
mhm,
and there is a reasonable chance of a large counter protest on a very contentious issue, let's say one triggered by a recent Supreme Court decision, um, the risk professional advice is stay away, get
mhm,
off the potential X. And yet that may not be the right answer for a representative democracy with freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. It may be the right thing to do for any particular person on any particular side of any particular cause, might be
mhm,
to get out there and peacefully um, make your views known as part of a collection of like-minded people.
mhm,
So it feels weird saying just avoid all crowds, because
mhm.
crowds are how political action can get done in this country, and can get done safely, as we've seen in the past. And yet I do have this fear in an era of an increased number of shootings, an increased number of mass shootings, that issues of protest become issues of potential targeting. And
Mhm.
how do you deal with that, to tell people in a representative democracy, get out there, make your voice felt, but don't become a victim or don't lead to a cycle of violence?
Well, I mean, so as a risk practitioner, first and foremost, what we do is we over-index on telling people that protests are good. They're exercising freedom of speech. It's your constitutional right. Please do it. Like, there should be nothing that should ever impede that, right? But as you're doing it, understand the escalation to potential violence,
So
right? If
again,
I'm
the
sitting out
situational
there,
awareness you spoke of earlier.
it's situational awareness. It's listening to the change of tone and rhetoric from either the side that you're on or somebody that may be counter protesting you. Protesters are very smart, right? They're educated. They're out there for a very specific reason, so they understand like what those changes are. And if one side of a political spectrum tries to escalate, don't match it in kind, right? Learn and understand de-escalation techniques that don't allow a peaceful situation to turn into something that could be tragic for everybody involved. I think the challenges these days is that let's go back to even like the George Floyd protests, where you had peaceful protesters, and this happens not just with George Floyd, it actually happens time and time again. We have peaceful protesters that actually have nefarious individuals who join the group literally to cause harm, literally to cause anxiety and problems, and try to undermine the credibility of that core group. And we've seen
Right.
that.
Right.
We've seen it on the left, and we've seen it on the right. I mean,
Hmm.
it's a tactic. It's a proven tactic. But you, as an individual, if you're engaging in that peaceful protest and tensions are rising, remove yourself from it. Right? Like, you'll be able to make your point another day. This issue isn't going away tomorrow, so you'll be able to come back tomorrow. You'll be able to voice your opinion absent of fear of violence. And I think it's just being smarter around how do you engage with counter protesters. And that's what, like, law enforcement tries to keep these groups separate all the time, but sometimes it's difficult. And as these groups come together, tensions rise because my personal ethos around and thoughts around something may be different than yours, and everyone wants to be right in this. And the reality is, no one's going to be right. Right? It's hard to change somebody's personal belief, but guess what's not going to do it? You know, Shouting at them, insulting them,
Hmm.
escalating calls for violence. Yeah, that's not going to do anything except transcend from political rhetoric into violence. And we've seen that. And I call it out all the time. I call it out on the left and I call it out on the right.
Yeah.
Like that is just, it's detractive from what like you're trying to do in that moment.
Right on. Well, John, as you know, we like to close out our conversations on Chatter by reaching into our Chatter box and pulling out a pre-printed random question. Sometimes they're personal. Sometimes they're more analytic. I can't tell you what it's going to be until I reach in and grab one. What common misperception about your profession or specialty makes your blood boil? And I'll let you choose here. It can be the Secret Service profession, or it can be risk analysis and risk prevention. But what common misperception about your profession makes your blood boil?
Well, it's not makes my blood boil, but I think as a risk practitioner, there's a notion that you can solve like any type of problem that's presented to you. Everything from, hey, can you let me know the probability of a Russian invasion into Ukraine, in the same vein of, hey, I locked my keys in my car. Can you tell me how to open the door? It's like, well, okay. I think a lot of people use risk practitioners, especially if they came out of like the FBI or the Secret Service or some sort of government agency, as sort of this like Swiss Army knife. Like we can solve all problems. We have an answer for everything. And when you don't have that instantaneous answer, they're like, well, like, oh, I thought you were in risk.
Yeah.
Like,
what good are you?
Well, I am in risk, but I just don't know like how to, take the plane off of, autopilot and land it myself. I just don't know how to do that. So I think that it's understanding what risk practitioners actually do. And it's formulaic. It's looking at and assessing threats and vulnerabilities, understanding the consequence of those threats and vulnerabilities to a certain issue, and then applying the right control measures. I mean, that's the framework, but everyone thinks that you can do all things for all people at all times.
It kind of reminds me of one of the themes, perhaps the main theme of Juliette Kayyem's book. You know Juliette well, as do I, but her book, The Devil Never Sleeps, really is about this theme of we focus so much on left of boom and making sure we can prevent. There you go. You've got a copy of it as I do.
I'm holding the book up. So
we have this real draw, almost a magnetic pull to we can just get better at preventing anything bad from happen. And we expect professionals, including risk professionals, to be able to do that. And yet they're going to happen. There are going to be disasters, and we need to learn to, deal with the results, try to minimize the harm from disasters, and not neglect that because we have this false illusion that we can prevent all of them in the first place.
Yeah. I think she has a great line in the book, and it's a talking point of hers around, just making it less bad. Right? Like that's what we need to do is just make it less bad. The world's bad enough, and these issues are bad enough. Like, how do we make them less bad?
Right.
And I know it's distilling it down and simplifying it, but she's right. I mean, that's what it's risk mitigation. You're never going to eliminate risk.
Yeah.
How do we reduce it as much as possible and mitigate it where we can?
Well, John, you've made me feel less bad in this conversation. I appreciate you sharing your experiences, your insights, and your thoughts on things. And hopefully a lot of listeners get a lot out of this, people who haven't learned the history of the Secret Service, but people who haven't thought about some of the bigger issues we've discussed as well. So thank you for joining me on Chatter.
Oh, no, thank you, David. I appreciate it, and I appreciate spending some time with your audience.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.